Hello again all, Dr. JC here. Welcome back. Lecture 8, Part 2. This is the second of 3 parts, 4-week or PowerPoint 8. And this go around we're going to focus specifically on the Franks, or the Frankish Empire. The larger underpinning theme here was the re-emergence of the Western Roman Empire, that the Christian or Catholic Church was the bulwark from which the West would rise. That will be seen here. In fact, we're going to talk about a few important individuals: Clovis, Charlemagne. We'll talk about a very important battle that's going to take place between Muslims and Christians, Battle of Tours. And then we'll also talk a little bit about what happens to this Frankish Empire, how it's going to fracture later on in its existence, and what impact that's going to have on the trajectory of Western Europe moving forward. Prior to getting into Clovis and the creation of this Frankish Empire, it is important to at least recognize that the Franks themselves were a Germanic-speaking people. Generally resided somewhere between the Loire and Rhine rivers, so those areas of France and bordering modern-day Germany. They were kind of part of the Roman Empire, kind of not, as legend holds, and for most part this is pretty true. The Romans were never able to fully conquer the Franks. They weren't. And in fact, we would refer to the Franks as being more Romanized than anything else, meaning that by the late Empire, prior to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire under Romulus Augustus, as we talked about previously, there had been so much intermixing and intermarriage between Germanic peoples and the Romans that these would be considered Romanized areas. So while we could think of them as former barbarians, they're anything but that. Okay, that's not the case. Rather, they would have been considered a pretty civilized people, if, however, a disparate people. In other words, there wasn't anything that brought them together. That is, until Clovis. Anyone that's traveled in France today, especially Paris, you're going to bump into the name Clovis. You just will, because he's still remembered as the first king of what's going to become France. Now, while it might seem a little bit weird that modern-day Dutch from a language is probably closer to really what the Franks spoke, he will be remembered, Clovis, as the individual that brought together various and numerous small Frankish kingdoms, all led by smaller royal chieftains, and he would systematically conquer them one by one. Now, when I talk about conquest here, I want to qualify that a little bit. It's important to remember that most of these areas that Clovis is going into are peopled by individuals that are ethnically relatively the same, which means that they can generally speak the same language, they have the same sort of social customs and social mores, the same sort of underpinning culture. Therefore, Clovis perhaps isn't as much as a conqueror as he is a stabilizer. This is an individual that's going to bring stable leadership and protection to people when it was completely absent and completely wanting. When the Roman Empire collapsed, Rome was gone. And when Rome's gone, so is all that protection and leadership. You may not have liked the Romans per se, but at least they provided security throughout society. You could walk down the street not worry about getting hit over the head. That wasn't necessarily the case once the Romans were gone, because it led to this power vacuum where different individual tribal leaders, local rulers, and chieftains are all fighting one another. This is a true sort of state of nature, a kill or be killed society. And as a result of that, when people are threatened in that way, they may look for a stronger central government to protect them. I mean, after all, did not the United States agree to this Patriot Act in the wake of 9/11? Thus, all Frankish peoples were okay with losing their local leaders and maybe losing a little local control and maybe losing a little liberty, if losing liberty meant security. And if the name Clovis meant security, then we're going to follow Clovis. Before moving on from Clovis, it's important to make note here that once all Frankish peoples recognize Clovis's leadership, he will become a new hereditary leader, which means that family rule, a new dynasty is going to be set into place, this Merovingian dynasty. Another key point that's going to occur here is the conversion of Clovis to Christianity. This will happen in what historians believe around 495-496, that this conversion was largely because of his wife Clotilda. Clotilda will later be venerated as a saint by the Catholic Church because of her acts. An important note there, remember, Christians are all Catholic at this point. There's no Protestant Reformation yet. That's coming later. Therefore, when Clovis goes ahead and embraces this Catholic faith, he, for all intents and purposes, creates a state religion here in France, much akin to what Constantine had done in the Eastern Roman Empire. And therefore, what Clovis can do is firmly develop society around his leadership, his family's leadership, and the Catholic Church. So two very important institutions, his government and the Catholic Church. That's going to help the Frankish Empire grow and expand. Prior to transitioning from Clovis to Charlemagne or Charlemagne, I wanted to take a look at this map brief, have a quick discussion here about those early Islamic caliphates, and talk specifically about how Islam and Christianity will come into contact with and conflict with one another in the area of Spain and modern-day France, or those areas in the upper left-hand corner of this map. Whether or not these Islamic caliphates had a master grand strategy of trying to surround the Byzantine Empire, rather than attacking them from the east, they're going to stretch across North Africa into Western Europe and come around the other side and force the Byzantines to fight on two fronts. Whether or not this was some master grand strategy, it's subject to much historical debate. What we do know, however, is that a major battle is going to be fought in France between Christians and Muslims. And in some ways, the argument made that it could very well have, the outcome of it, saved Christianity. I do think there's merit to the argument, and we'll talk about that important battle, the Battle of Tours, next. In order to locate Tours first, if you look at the F in Frankish Empire in this map, about 11 o'clock from the F, you'll see a red dot there. That's Tours. This is where this battle is going to be fought. Clearly, Islamic forces led by Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi understood and recognized the Frankish Empire was the gem. Conquer the Frankish Empire, and the door to Europe is wide open. You can walk through it and go anywhere you want, to include attack the Byzantines from the west, if you so choose. The Frankish Empire was the key, and Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi was going to go right for that key. As Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, or Abdul Rahman as he's known to history, made his way deeper into France, Charles Martel decided to move his Frankish infantry out in front of the city of Tours, and Charles Martel was able to choose the battleground. This is important. Because he had less cavalry than Abdul Rahman, Charles Martel decided to put his troops on sloping ground in between two heavily wooded areas. He would use the heavily wooded areas on both of his sides as a defense or protector against any flank attack that might come from Abdul Rahman's cavalry. Therefore, he's forced Abdul Rahman to charge head on, and that's exactly what Abdul Rahman's going to do on 10 October 732, and his forces will break like water on rock. As he's leaving the field, Abdul Rahman will be fighting rear guard action, and he will be killed. Therefore, Charles Martel will be remembered to Frankish history and to French history as the Hammer. He will get the military name or nom de guerre as Charles the Hammer Martel for his fighting here at the Battle of Tours in October of 732. Whether this reversal of Umayyad forces at the hands of Charles Martel here at the Battle of Tours actually saved Christianity is subject to some debate. What is less debated, however, is that Charles Martel and his bloodline would continue to rule and expand this Frankish Empire. We'll turn next to his maybe more famous grandson, Charlemagne. While clearly we could spend an eternity talking about Charlemagne or Charlemagne here because of his importance to history, especially as it relates to European history, the rise of what will eventually be the modern nation-states of France and Germany. Rather, I'm just going to provide some bullet points here as it relates to his military conquests, and then we'll focus a little bit more on his form of governance, his bureaucratic system, and how in some ways it compares perhaps with the Byzantine structure. Charlemagne's going to be pretty successful at expanding Frankish borders in almost any direction on the compass, save perhaps two. One to the southwest, trying to push these Moorish peoples, those Umayyads, off the continent entirely. He's going to be unsuccessful doing that. In fact, it's going to take about 700 years to do that. And he's also going to be a little bit unsuccessful in trying to drive into Scandinavia. He's a little bit leery of moving into these Viking lands, or what will eventually be Viking lands. And there's this quasi sort of truce. I think it's in some ways a mutual respect of the power between what will eventually be these Vikings and Charlemagne's forces of the Franks. Charlemagne's administration, however, I want to pause a little bit and talk briefly about this, largely because I think you're going to see there's some parallels here to Byzantine bureaucracy. Like the Byzantine, Charlemagne's going to break his empire up into various units. He's going to have individuals out there, the CIA and KGB, those spies known as Misi, out there to go ahead and make sure these administrators are doing their job. He's going to show a degree of tolerance to all peoples, whether they happen to be citizens of the Frankish Empire or those that are conquered. And he's going to be an instrument of change. He's going to be viewed as a liberator as much as he is a conqueror. So very important points there, and in some ways very similar to what we've seen in the Byzantine structure as well. Also akin to the Byzantine Empire, we talked about that concept of Caesaropapism, where you have one individual that's in charge of religion or spirituality and in charge of the civil or secular side. Lots of power there. This is not to imply that Charlemagne or the Frankish system was an established Caesaropapism. It's not. What it is, rather, is this idea that Charlemagne recognized the emerging power of the Catholic Church, the importance of the Bishop of Rome or the Pope as the religious leader across Europe, and that this religious leader across Europe had the power to appoint a quasi-Mac Daddy of Europe, or an Emperor of the Romans, or Holy Roman Emperor. This was the title all kings or civil leaders were looking to achieve, and that can only come from the Pope. Charlemagne will get that title, and he's going to set off this ongoing sort of struggle or trajectory for civil leaders, kings, to want to continuously try to endear themselves to the Catholic Church, to the Pope, to achieve the highest of titles, which is Holy Roman Emperor. As we've seen throughout the course, especially with empires that deal with hereditary rule, at some point they unravel. That will be the case here, the Frankish Empire as well. Because time's going to limit how much we can focus on the actual succession of Charlemagne once he passes, I will give a brief snapshot here leading up to this important Treaty of Verdun. Charlemagne's only legitimate remaining son was this individual depicted here, Louis the Pious. Louis the Pious himself had 3 sons, Charles the Bald, Lothair, Louis the German, and he wanted each of these individuals to have some control over an aspect of the empire. Therefore, he divided it into parts. As you may recall, when we talked about Rome, however, how did that work out when we did the first and second triumvirates? Not so well. It's not going to be much different here. The brothers are going to at some point get cross with one another, civil war is going to break out, and eventually these wars will end, and a tri-division of the empire will be solidified at this Treaty of Verdun. The Treaty of Verdun is important because this Frankish Empire will completely end at that point. And it will allow different peoples within these different regions to start to chart their own history. And we'll start to see the emergence now of what will eventually be a modern French state, and while it will take much longer on the German side, a German state as well. So the Treaty of Verdun, a formal split of the empire, and it's going to allow these future nation states to start to chart their own course in their own history. Before turning to part 3 of this lecture on medieval Europe, specifically feudalism, I wanted to provide a summary of the Franks, the impact that the Frankish Empire had on Europe. While you can read here on this slide several of the points associated with the Frankish Empire and its impact on Europe, I want to highlight those that are underlined here. Points 2 and point 5. Not only did this growth of the Frankish Empire enable the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, a degree of independency from the Byzantine Empire. He didn't have to look east anymore to ask for help. That help now could come from Europe itself, Western Europe. And because of that independency, we're going to start to see now the power of the Roman Catholic Church in Rome re-emerge. So just as power had shifted east to Constantinople, it's eventually going to shift back to Rome. We see that happening here under the Franks. Also, we talked about that Treaty of Verdun, that tri-division there. It's going to set into motion, this tri-division, a series of different small-scale engagements, different individuals, knights and nobles, all vying for power within certain regions, all vying for titles, the most supreme title of all, Holy Roman Emperor for the Pope. So what we're going to see emerge from that Treaty of Verdun then is this feudal age. And to the feudal age we'll turn next. Dr. JC out. Part 2 here. We'll go into feudalism next in part 3.